Welcome, everyone, to Podcast Trailers, a playbook for producing successful teasers. This is a brand new webinar. The reason you see the date April 2026 on your screen is that is the date that the study came out of the field. Podcast trailers. What are podcast trailers? Well, they're like they're promos, similar to movie trailers that you're used to seeing before a movie. They're there to promote your podcasts and get you interested in it. And we'll tell you a story in just a couple of minutes about how we came up with this idea and introduce you to everybody that's on the webinar today. But before we get started with that, I just want to provide you a little bit of context as to what we're doing today. So there are going to be actionable insights that you can put in place today. And in fact, one of our presenters today, Peter, as soon as he saw this data, he put it in action right away. But there will be other things that are very contextual because we're testing for podcasts, meaning there will be things that are dependent on your show and your category and your hosts and your promo voice. So some of these results may vary. At the end of all this, as we go through all of the data and share what we found, we're going to end with some key findings that we think that you'll be able to put into action yourself. So let's introduce everybody here, starting with me, Jay Naklis. I am a vice president and consultant at Coleman Insights. We are a research firm that helps podcasters build stronger brands and make great content. Ariel?
My name's Ariel. I am excited to be here. Thank you for having me. I love podcast trailers and pretty much everything about the podcast industry and podcast creators. I host a podcast called Trailer Park, the podcast trailer podcast, where I feature a trailer and then I analyze that trailer. And I've been doing it for a few years. So I've heard a lot of different trailers and now I've seen a lot of different trailers. And that's what makes me uniquely qualified to be here today. And I think in a moment we'll get into that.
I'm Peter Ferrioli. I'm one of the founders, CTO and COO of Pantheon Media. We've been around for about 11 years. We're the world's largest music and culture podcast network. And we've been building trailers for our podcasters for a decade. And we started way back when you had to make it. We didn't know why we were making trailers. We were just told we had to do it. And we've been doing it that way ever since. So when Ariel and Jay mentioned the survey, we happened to be launching a few shows that we thought we could fit into this as we launched, and we are excited to take part in this.
And our other partner in this is, you see her picture on the screen there is Rachel Corbett. She is the network director of Nova Podcasts, which is a very large broadcast and digital company in Australia. And so essentially, if we're doing something live in the United States, she's almost certainly asleep. And so that is why she's not joining us. Hi, Rachel. We miss you. Ariel has been kind enough to take Rachel's part. So when we get to her podcasts and the data associated, she will go ahead and introduce those. Before we get into the sample and how we did this, Ariel, let's talk a little bit about how we came up with this idea for the study. And it really was me first reaching out to you because you mentioned Trailer Park earlier. I'd heard Trailer Park. I really love the podcast. And I love this idea of evaluating how trailers perform. And I thought it might be interesting to do some research on it.
Yeah, I first started caring about trailers when I went on a road trip with a friend. And I found that the trailers that we were testing before listening to a bunch of shows were not reflective of the shows themselves, kind of false advertising. So I got to thinking about what makes a good trailer. Does a good trailer make you want to go check out the show right now? And probably more importantly, does the show accurately reflect the tone and the scope and what's going to be in that show? So that's what helped me come up with the idea for the Trailer Park podcast. And since then, I've analyzed a whole lot of trailers and been doing a lot of thinking about trailers. And I found that there are a lot of mistakes that creators make. Number one is not having a trailer. So that's the first thing. One big takeaway is if you don't have a trailer, make a trailer today. And of course, today we're going to get into how to do that and what should go into it. But Jay, you replied to one of my emails where I mentioned a recent episode of the show, and you basically were like, let's get some data behind this.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm looking forward to one of the things we're going to be doing after this is today we're going to present you the results of the study. We're going to tell you at the end how to get the report for yourself. But also, each one of us individually, me and Peter and Rachel, will be joining Ariel for an episode of Trailer Park, where we're going to take another kind of micro look and deep dive into this study, which will be a lot of fun.
The story behind the story.
Yes. So let's first talk about, before we get into the results, let's talk about who's in this. So first, to get into the study, you had to report listening to a podcast at least a few times in a typical month. So the word listening is important here because, as you know, there's a lot of stuff being done with video. And in our own research and other research you've seen out there, we know that the large majority of podcast consumers do alternate between watching and listening podcasts. But in this particular case, we're going to be evaluating audio trailers. So therefore, you have to be a listener. You could be a watcher and a listener, but you can't be an only watcher. But that doesn't exclude many podcast consumers. You have to listen to podcasts at least a few times in a typical month. There are 500 total participants, and that's a nationally representative sample across the United States. We show you this listening habits screen, not because it's anything revolutionary, because any podcast study will show you this kind of data, which is essentially showing you that about 83% of all podcast listeners listen on at least a weekly basis, and 35% of them, just over a third, listen on a daily basis. The reason we show this to you is as we get into the evaluation of these different podcast trailers, in some cases, you'll notice that daily listeners have an opinion one way or the other, and their opinion is a little bit outsized because, like many things, you've heard that a small percentage of consumers account for most consumption. That's the 80-20 rule. And so in this case, those 35% of daily listeners account for most podcast listening. So that's why we mention it, and we'll bring up those daily listeners a little bit later. This is the methodology that every participant went through. First, they listened to two versions of the same trailer with just one variable changed, because you don't want to change too many things. You want to try and isolate the one thing that's different. We'll tell you what those variables are in a minute. Which one do you prefer of choice A and choice B? And once you've selected your favorite, we ask you, what do you remember about it? And I remember when we designed this study, we were just so interested in what would come from this, because there's no drop-down box, no answer key. This was literally just, you could remember anything about it. And we were really curious what people would remember and what would be sticky. And then finally, what is your listening intent based on the trailer that you just heard? So here are the 4 shows and the variables that we chose. And we were very intentional about selecting the variables for each because they were, some of them were very timely, but they were also, I think, Peter and Ariel, from a creator standpoint, it felt like these were things that were, as you're actually designing, right, or developing a trailer, these are things that were interesting to you to learn.
Yeah, the idea behind this study, which was for the show called High Scrollers, was, is it more captivating to listen to a trailer where the hosts are talking about the unique value proposition of that show? Or is there an authoritative third party voice that could come in and lend legitimacy to that show? And then we also had Better Than Yesterday, the Sizzle versus Explainer. This is Rachel's other show from Nova. And the idea here is, do we want, as potential listeners, to listen to the host of the show tell you what's going to be in the show? Or would we rather have a sampling of examples, little pieces from the show here and there? And I feel like that one is interesting because that's the most quote unquote typical that you'll hear. People put together a bunch of different clips and they try to, give a sampling. That's kind of like it's low lift, essentially. You've already made the show, you've got a lot of clips. Can we bring them together, and can that be a sell for the show?
Yeah, and it's going to be kind of a unique when you're listening to it, because we are going to play you some of the clips from these trailers, but we're not going to play. We kind of debated back and forth. Should we play the entire thing? Because they're all 60 seconds. That was the other thing, is we didn't want some to be 60s, some to be 30s. You want them to all be on a level playing field. And so in the case of that one, if we were to spend doing all of them, we would be spending a lot of time on playing these trailers. So we ended up deciding we're going to play the first 15 seconds. When you hear Better Than Yesterday's trailers, the Sizzle versus Explainer, because you're only hearing the first 15 seconds, they're going to sound similar because all of the clips come after that first 15 seconds. You're just going to have to imagine that it goes into some different clips. Peter, for Superfan Diaries, one of your shows, AI versus Authentic, I think we all thought this was going to be one of the most, we were all very interested in this. When I talk about timely, AI certainly fits that bill, right?
Yeah, and I think 2 things are important here when we're choosing these variables, from, the amount of different variables you could possibly choose and trying to understand how to best create a trailer and then drive intention and the results. The couple of the standard things are the call to action and how long should a trailer be, right? Right off the top, we knew those were two things that marketing and people had studied. You could see the fallout rates on everyone's podcast of how long they listen. So coming up with other new variables in today's world of how we're making podcasts. And there is a lot of AI usage in different ways out there. So we figured we would find a show we would test whether AI could drive excitement and a fast reaction to something that had high energy versus maybe a more authentic version of that. So in this test, coming up, you'll hear they're basically the same scripts in both, the same music. AI parses the cadence and voices out. It's just a little different way, but that was how we wanted to see what drove that high level of intention with energy. And then the other show is Binge or Cringe. And essentially with this one, the variables were the old marketing adage that, your first impression, everyone's going to make a decision about your content in the first 10 seconds. So whether they want to continue to consume it, do you hook them in that first 10 seconds? And how do you do that and what works? So we chose to change basically the first 15 seconds there and how that show was introduced to the listener.
Okay. Excellent. So if you think about this, 500 people evaluating 4 different podcasts, 8 total versions, and they could have said anything about what they remember. And as we poured through all of this data, there were really just 5 main themes that kept coming up about all of the versions that were tested. And these are the 5 themes. First thing was tone. And when we say tone, we're not talking about any tone, but we're talking specifically about energy. They would use words about like that one was upbeat, that one was energetic. The name of the show, of course, is important. Do they remember what it was called? They mentioned topic clarity, so they know what the show was about. Ease of understanding is mentioned. I understood that one better. And then authenticity, of which they use different words. Authentic is one of them, real, natural. This came up quite a bit. And this is going to be one of the through lines that'll be important when we get to the findings a little bit later on. So Ariel, why don't you start by introducing High Scrollers, and then we will play the 2 versions.
Yeah, this is a show hosted by 2 influencers, as far as I understand, in Australia. I regret that I don't know more about Australian pop culture. But yeah, we're going to hear 2 different trailers here. First, I believe we're doing the host read, and then we'll do the third person. And I guess I want people, as they're listening, to think about what is most attractive to them, and then to see how it lines up with the answers from our survey participants.
Okay, perfect. Here is the host read version.
This just came up on my For You page.
It's giving gorgeous. It's giving iconic.
Are we going to talk about her new boyfriend or?
I don't know if she could slay any harder than she already is.
I'm Brittany Saunders.
And I'm all right, hey.
And welcome to our brand new podcast, High Scrollers.
The only podcast where your screen time is not judged, it's celebrated.
So it's both hosts. I also want to bring up Rachel. In one of the early conversations we had, Rachel was a little bit worried about the Australian accents. You're doing a study in the US. Is that going to be an obstacle? We didn't think it would be, and it really wasn't. We had a lot of comments, and of course there were some people that mentioned the accent, but we found that these themes showed up throughout, regardless of whether or not it was her shows or Peter's shows, and it wasn't any sort of negative trend towards listening intent or comments. So we felt pretty good about that. So that was the host read version. Now let's take a look at this 3rd person version. So this is a professional voiceover artist doing the promo.
Looking for your new pop culture obsession? Meet the High Scrollers podcast, hosted by Brittany Saunders and All Right Hey.
I'm into avatars. They are hot.
Please go to therapy.
If your screen time is slightly alarming, but your taste is elite, you're in the right place.
So what did you think was going to win?
I personally thought that B was going to win. I just, whatever makes me feel better after I hear the end of the first, that trailer just, it gives me a better feeling, more energy.
I loved the first one. I think especially for a show like this, where it's so host dependent. I mean, I'm thinking also about the delivery on the promise. So if you are being given an announcer read or a third person, how are we going to make sure that that's translated to the show? So for me, I guess in retrospect, I'm thinking to myself, I want to know who these people are to decide if I'm going to listen.
Yeah. And so I think right off the bat, when we did this and we looked at the results, there was some surprise. Rachel in particular, I know, was really surprised. She thought the host was going to do better. What you're looking at here, if you look at the left, the dark blue bars, that's the host read version, and the lighter blue is the third person. So you can see overall, third person wins. It really wins, particularly with the 18-34-year-olds, the younger set. Wins big with women, 57% to 43%. And this is where, again, I will say that the context comes into play, because this is these hosts and it's that third person read. So it doesn't mean that every person that would voice the third person version would be the same, and it's different by show. But I think there was definitely some surprise with this one. And this is the way to read this. So then we took the comments. And the way to read this is, so you have the host version, version A on the left, version B, third person on the right. If something came up more often in one version in the comments, then we put it underneath. If it came up around the same amount, we put it in both. And then you're going to see a couple of the comments underneath, and then we'll mention those percentages here in a minute. So in other words, the show name was remembered more in the host version. They definitely gave it credit for being more upbeat. And the topic was mentioned almost equally, where they found the third person easier to understand, and they found that one to be more authentic and relatable, as you can see there in that top comment. I'd also draw you to that bottom comment on the right, which there's a couple of times in these comments throughout that you're going to see this kind of thing mentioned, where it felt more natural and more like a podcast, not an ad. That's an important comment. It didn't feel like a commercial to them. The way to read the orange box on the top right is that 50% of all the comments in version B, third person, mention something about clarity, easy of understanding, versus 35% of all the comments in version A. And then authenticity, look at the difference. Those are significant numbers. 45%, nearly half of all the comments in the third person mention authenticity, versus only 25% in version A. So if you're reading this so far, the way to read all of these is, first we show you an overall picture. So overall, third person was the winner. Then we see the comments, and it definitely leads towards third person. And then there's one more measure we just showed you, which is intent. And these are the respondents who preferred each promo that said they are very likely to listen. We isolated that passion, right? Those that say they're very likely to listen. And here, overall, 1834s, women, and those oversized daily podcast listeners all went for third person. So I have to say that this is a pretty clear takeaway, right?
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about after the study, especially with this one in particular, is that daily listener and how more tuned their ear is. Yeah, you say they're an outlier, a little bit, or have more weight, obviously. But I also think that they hear more podcasts, right? So they also they're maybe have this influence that should be a little more weighted. But in general, that recommendation, I think the interesting thing about the sales thing is this: you only have 15 seconds or 60 seconds. Somebody really can't get to know who you are in that short time. So I agree with Ariel that I want to yearn to know more about the host and what the relationship I could potentially be getting into in a show. I think it's also hard because in 15 seconds, you've got to somebody who doesn't know who you are, you're trying to sell yourself as to who you are to prove that you're worthy of their ears or listen, versus that third party recommendation that comes in and again feels like that voice of God or gravitas in the movie trailers, like, go see this movie, right? It's not an actor in the movie, telling you about it. So I think it works sometimes, it doesn't work other ways, but I really felt that that recommendation and feeling like I'm somebody else, and they weren't trying to sell themselves, maybe was why I liked it.
Yeah, maybe when you have a short amount of time and you know that, it is important, especially when your show is new, to go for a third party to legitimize you. Maybe third season, second season, whatever it is, you get to nod to your existing audience, but maybe when you're first starting out, having somebody else sign off is probably a great thing to test out.
I think that's an awesome point. All right, Peter, take us into Superfan Diaries.
Yeah, so this one, again, we picked this. This show is built around fandom, passion, people who care deeply about sports and culture. It's done by a psychiatrist who looks at these super fans and the healthiness of being a super fan of anything in your life. Right, that's what the show's about. So we picked it to see whether that high-produced AI-style version of energy would drive the excitement, or the more authentic conversational tone would win here.
All right, let's take a look at version number 1, and then we'll tell you which one is which.
The kick is up, and the kick is good. Afternoon, and welcome back to the Superfan Diaries. I'm your host, J.R. Green, recording from our studios on Broadway in downtown Nash Vegas.
Okay. And here's the other one.
The kick is up, and the kick is good afternoon, and welcome back to the Superfan Diaries. I'm your host, J.R. Green, recording from our studios on Broadway in downtown Nash Vegas, bringing you the biggest sports, the biggest moments, and the biggest fans.
So when we presented this in London at the podcast show, we asked the audience whether or not they could identify each one. And they pretty easily did, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, I think most people have, again, in our industry, their ears are a little more tuned.
Yeah. And I thought, me too. When I first heard this, I immediately thought that there was the AI one. It was, and then I think we hoped the authentic one would do better. And ultimately, it was, if you look at overall on the left, it's essentially a statistical tie, right? 51% authentic. However, some bigger differences when you look at younger consumers and women who more significantly preferred the authentic version, which I didn't find terribly surprising. To me, I thought, okay, that tracks a little bit. Is that what you guys thought?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Ariel.
I was just going to say that feels like it resonates with me.
Yeah.
And then the younger number, the 18 to 34, leaning towards the authentic, there is quite a bit of that. And if somebody even sniffs something's a little AI, they will reject it wholeheartedly, I believe.
Yeah. And then we wanted to see, okay, in the comments, does that align with what we saw overall? And, the answer for the most part is yes. So if you look at the AI version, they gave that one credit for being more energetic and upbeat, which I think makes a lot of sense. That first part that we heard, the kick is up and it's good, right? It has this very upbeat cadence. And I think people picked up on that. To your point, Peter, like they're paying attention to that first 10, 15 seconds, and that boom, that stuck with them, I think, for energy. The topic was about equal, but that authentic version, people gave it credit for being more authentic. They found it easier to understand. They remembered the show more. And you got to look at that comment on the bottom right. It sounded more real. Version A sounds like fake AI. And you got to remember that those labels, AI and authentic, were not for the respondent. They had no idea how we labeled these. They didn't know which was which. So the fact that, and we saw several of those, the fact that the respondent was able to say with no prompting that was AI, I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, for us, we just want to use AI as a tool, and we're trying to understand as an industry how we can best use it going forward. So one of the things we're looking for in this variable is if and how we should continue to use it in certain ways. And sometimes it works for the energy, and then other times it doesn't.
But now you're going to see the thing that threw us for a loop more than anything in the study. So we saw overall there's a slight lean towards the authentic version. In the comments, there's a notable lean towards the authentic version. But then there's that last piece of the puzzle, which is, well, how likely are you to listen to this show? And this is very likely to listen. So why is it that people preferred the authentic version? Why is it that the comments leaned heavily towards the authentic version? But when you ask them which one they're very likely to listen to, the AI version wins in a landslide.
This got me. I do not know. Peter, your theories?
Yeah, I mean, I again, we talk about it being the category, the hypiness of the vibe of the show, and AI, it's for us, it's about when you say the words energy and vibe, right? That's different than. It doesn't mean it's not authentic, right? That if we look at the way that we're defining the word authentic, if authentic is trying to drive you to the actual content and deliver what you're going to get after you go from this trailer there. If it's made by AI versus made by a human, and authentic, it's not just the human voice, but is it the real deal in the story? So I feel like, yes, if it matches the energy and the category and the vibe that AI won and made people just want to go check it out right away, and their instincts just, they didn't stop and go, well, just because it's AI, I'm not going to go hear it. I mean, all AI is not bad. That's what it comes down to, I guess.
I think that's part of it. And I think this is very contextual. I think this is one of those examples that's very contextual, as you alluded to, because it really, if we get into the next show, which Ariel will set up here in a second, which is a mental health show. I mean, in this case, if you had a real high energy trailer, I think it would be very, very different in how it was received and how it mapped towards intent. So let's talk about this show, Better Than Yesterday, which is one of the Australian ones.
Yeah, this one was interesting because I believe, as I was talking about before, if somebody is well known already, maybe there's not necessarily a need for a third party to sign off on them. In this case, the host is somebody that people know. He's been around. He's, I believe, a former TV presenter.
Yep.
And because of that, maybe he can quote unquote get away with less of a setup. So I think that's what some of the findings will give us here. But first, we've got the sizzle, and then we've got the explainer trailer.
Yep. And just a reminder that the first version you're going to hear is the sizzle. It's not going to sound super sizzly because the clips come after the first 15 seconds, but you will hear some differences in the first 15 seconds. So this is the host, Osher, doing both of these reads. So here's the sizzle.
G'day. My name's Osher Ginsberg. I'm a recovering TV host, a best-selling author, and every week since 2013, my podcast, Better Than Yesterday, delivers useful tools and useful conversations to make your day today just a little bit better than yesterday.
Okay, so really there he's talking about the show and kind of the setup, and then after that he goes into highlights of the show. In B here, listen to the different approach that he takes in describing the show.
G'day. My name's Osher Ginsberg. I'm a recovering television host, best-selling author, dad, stepdad, and someone who goes through life with a different brain. Since 2013, I've been making a podcast called Better Than Yesterday. It does what it says on the box. Useful tools and useful conversations to help make your day today better than yesterday.
I mean, they're really different, right? I mean, the second one feels a little bit more personal. He's tying his own experience into why there's a why there, into why he did the show, where the one in the beginning feels a little bit more just here's the show and some highlights. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look at the difference. So overall, this is nearly a tie. If you look overall on the left, Sizzle 51, 49 for the explainer, but it was the men that give the sizzle a little bit more oomph, again, where the women a little bit more towards the explainer. Again, this is kind of like the other one we looked at with AI versus authentic. This lean didn't particularly surprise me when we went into it. So not a big winner necessarily here, but I would say when you get into the comments, there's a really big winner. This is where it gets separated because the only theme that was dominant in Sizzle was energy, and you would expect it to be. Right? That's of any of the themes you would expect that. And look at what they said. I liked the clips. It's sped up fast. Okay, great. And it's funny that they said also shorter. It wasn't shorter. This is also think about how perception. I used to program radio stations, I would sometimes say, and they would say, well, how long should your break be? And it's the same thing about, well, how long should my podcast be? Well, a 5-minute podcast can sound like an hour, and an hour-long podcast can sound like 5 minutes, right? It all depends on how well you're doing it and how engaging you're making it. And so in this case, the sizzles felt shorter to them, but that's just pure perception. They were both 60 seconds, but that explainer was more sticky. It was more engaging, and they remembered the show name more. They found it easier to understand. They found it more authentic, and they remembered what the show was about. And they specifically talk about it being personal. They talk about the heartfelt tone and huge wins for ease of understanding. If you look at the orange box, and wow, for authenticity, 71%, nearly 3 out of every 4 comments on that explainer mentioned authenticity. You guys, that's massive.
Yeah.
That was big. Yeah. Go ahead.
For a long time, when we have new shows onboarding, we always go through the practice of recording 2 to 4 shows before they put the trailer together, to have some clips to put in there, right? To give the listener a sense of what they're going to expect. And, you pick up some of the style and tone from that. So for me, some of the results were surprising because, we've been taking some of that approach of what's coming up, what's gone on, throwing that in there, and not as much of a, hi, I'm this person and this is what I'm going to talk about every time you listen to my show, so for me, this was surprising. And maybe it's just not that great big pile of clips that are sexy and you just throw together from big names or hot quotes or controversial takes that you throw out there. It doesn't work as well, basically.
I believe a big part of the game here when figuring out what your trailer should sound like is knowing your audience or knowing a lookalike audience if you're a net new show, and respecting that they're smart and that they can figure out what the show is about to an extent by, especially if you're a known figure. So you don't necessarily need to spoon feed them. And I do often say on my show about trailers that, if you don't have a trailer and you need to put one up today, it's okay to spoon feed your listeners. It's okay. That's like a V1 to say, this is the name of the show. I am the host. Here's what the show is about. But if you've got a little bit more flexibility, know about your audience, like in this case, I believe you have a little bit more leeway to produce something a little bit more a little bit less on the nose.
Yeah, because I think there's the emotional resonance of this show and the heartfelt nature of the explainer. Really, this category leans into that.
I totally agree, and I think that if you heard the rest of the trailer, he talks about his kids. He really goes even deeper in his personal experience, and so as we talked about earlier, and as you'll really see in the next example, the first 10 to 15 seconds is crucial in grabbing attention. But I think in this case, here was an example of where we saw he did grab your attention in the beginning, and then people did remember things later in the promo that stuck with them because he had that hook. So you've got to think of it both in the beginning, are you hooking them, and then also holistically, but not just holistically. And then contextually for sure. And Ariel, what you just talked about too, we at Coleman, we talk about outside thinking a lot, which is this idea that we as creators are always thinking from our own experience. It's very hard to not, because the way we listen or watch podcasts is very different than the average consumer, for example. And so this idea of setting up a show in a Broadway every single time, this is who I am. This is the name of the show. This is what it's about. And you might say as a creator, well, I've already done that. I do that every single time. But there's always a new listener. There's always a reset to do. There's never a harm in constantly resetting it, because it just helps you consistently brand that show and get them to come back. And when it comes to intent, it definitely leaned towards explainer. Only the men had slightly higher intent on the sizzle, but everybody else had higher intent on the explainer. So we're seeing things line up, with the exception of Superfan, where intent was the wacky swing towards the AI version. Here we really saw authenticity get stronger with the explainer, with intent and the comments. Final show, Binge or Cringe.
So this is a show that has a large Facebook following for many, many years, and is just launching their podcast. So we took the opportunity to do the testing here to then take some of the results and apply them on the actual trailer we released. This is a personality-led about streaming shows. It's two women, but the real product here is their verdict-driven conversations and their chemistry between the women. So we wanted to know in this first 15 seconds if we make that clear, or if they just thought it was another generic TV show recommendation type podcast. So you'll notice in one, the hosts do introduce themselves, get a little more personal, and the other one, it's a little different. So let's go with A.
Yep. And each one is identical except for the first 15 seconds that you will hear here.
Stop doom scrolling through Netflix. You've been scrolling for 20 minutes. You're not browsing, you're spiraling. I'm Jamie Jaffe.
And I'm Susie Lazarus.
Together, we are
the self-proclaimed
Queens of Stream.
Yeah. So as you point out, most of that is about them and who they are, right, in the first version. So here's intro 2.
Netflix just asked if you're still watching.
And honestly, we're asking the same thing.
You've opened 5 apps.
You've rejected 12 trailers.
And somehow landed back on season 1 of a show that you already quit.
Okay. So version 2, they come out of the gate with Netflix, and they do not talk about themselves. So intro number 1, the version where they introduce themselves, this is one of our more notable wins. Overall, 54% to 46%, and then very strong wins, and our strongest win with men, 60 to 40. Peter, did this surprise you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely surprised me, because the Netflix. Well, I'll let you. Let's wait till you get to the next slide before we talk about what was surprising.
Sure.
So I don't want to spoil it.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. So the numbers go. This was one of those, I think, where you look at alignment between the score and the comments. There's pretty solid, like, no doubt alignment here, right? The score definitely leans towards number 1, and the comments go really towards number 1. And the show name was remembered in both, but when they mentioned authenticity for that first intro, they use words like relatable and welcoming, which makes sense because they were introducing themselves. They found it easier to understand. They remember the topic on both. We liked the comment on the bottom left. The show feels like if the critical drinker was a pair of bored housewives. I think it sounds rather entertaining. Huge percentages there on the bottom. More than half mentioned authenticity in the first one. But we think one of the biggest takeaways here that Peter was about to get to, but wanted to wait till I showed this, is those two comments on the right. It's a podcast about Netflix shows, and and maybe even more importantly, it's an ad for Netflix. How about that?
Yeah, this is this is the problem is, they're remembering the category. And this goes back to, I believe, the second trailer that we tested where, the less ad sounding intro here won, right? And it sounds less like an ad. And even though you're taking a shot at Netflix in the first 5 seconds of the trailer, it didn't make a difference, right? That's not what people remembered if they were thinking it was an ad for Netflix. So in that 60 seconds, you only have a certain amount of time, especially in that first 15, to get through who you are, what the show title is, and trigger those memories. And you don't want, unless Netflix was paying us for that trailer, trust me, Jay, we removed Netflix from the trailer.
Immediate takeaways already. We kind of alluded to this at the beginning that there are some things that you can action on right away. And I love that you heard that and you were like, nope, that's not what we're going for.
Yeah, completely. And the intent also lined up. So all three lined up really clearly in this one for Binge or Cringe. It wasn't massively higher intent on most measures, but it was slightly higher intent on most of them, and especially those daily listeners, which again, they drive the most listening. So the fact that they really felt like intro one was the one that resonated with them is important to mention here. So the less ad sounding one is the one that wins the day. So let's take you through the key findings and takeaways from the study. So the first thing, and I mentioned this at the top of the webinar, is authenticity. You heard this come up a lot. This was a theme that came up a lot. And there's a through line through all of the trailers that we tested. And 3 out of the 4 shows, the one that was perceived as more authentic won on both preference and listening intent. And I think, although there's some context, I think you guys that is probably a lesson that many can apply to their podcast in almost every case, right?
Yeah, most definitely. I want to jump in here and say that you can apply this to your past trailer. Make sure you go back, and the actionable item from all this takeaway and the data telling us that is that you're not stuck with what you have. You can actually go back and update it today.
And I'll also say authenticity and intimacy is something that we've been hearing for so long in the podcast space. Anybody who discovers podcasts for the first time as a consumer, they're like, I just love it because I really get to be in the lives of the people that I'm listening to, and to have data for it is really validating.
Yeah, it's an intimate medium, right? Audio in particular is intimate. And so consider that the whiz bang trailer may not be your best bet. Giving a real clear, natural, authentic read of what it is and what it's about and why they should listen is generally going to be the way to go. And this data validates that. Now, who leans authentic? Ariel, you mentioned earlier on that this tracked with you. It made sense. There were some commonalities as to where authenticity leaned, and it was younger listeners, it was women, and it was daily podcast consumers.
Because we can smell bullshit.
There you go.
I listen to a lot, and I think that means our threshold is a little higher. So it's got to be good, and it's got to be delivering a unique value that makes us want to listen.
Yeah, well said. And another a kind of subheading for authenticity, just another piece of the authenticity puzzle. Another point in that argument is that if it was mentioned as the one with authentic delivery, that was the one that had more show name recall. So if you're trying to make the name of your show stickier, authenticity again is the way to go. Now, Superfan Diaries was our twist, as we talked about. And energy can drive intent, but if you're looking at this kind of energy upbeat versus something a little bit more authentic, that is kind of an exception. But as we talked about, context matters. And particularly for that particular show, I suppose we're saying that the energy worked, and maybe it depends on your category and your hosts in the show, right?
Yeah, 100%. Again, if our intention is to drive listener intent using a choice there, then this wins. I mean, at the end of the day, if 10,000 people listen to that trailer and more people click through and follow it and become followers and listeners, then that's really what matters, is what we're saying here.
Yeah. So I guess building your trailer with the idea in mind, because we now know there's data to back it up, with the idea that you want to get people to listen to this 30, 60, 90-second piece and then go and listen to the show. There are a few ways to do it, right? You could signal to them very clearly, all right, so go check out the show. Episodes start dropping on this day. Or you could just make something really great that makes it undeniable that this is what they need to do after listening to it.
Yeah. And coming back to what you said, Ariel, a few minutes ago, that, being able to smell BS, like it was amazing how many listeners mentioned that something felt like an ad, and they weren't saying it in a positive way. It was definitely a negative. So if you're making something that sounds like a commercial as a podcast trailer, pivot, turn the car around, go the other way, because they are sensitive to it. They can tell the difference, and it's not the way to go.
That may be a little bit of a red light or a stop sign for the branded podcast industry to pay attention and how they present storytelling through branded eyes, because yes, you've got to have a very natural way of doing that.
Yep, for sure. If you want to get a copy of this study, you can go to our website, ColemanInsights.com. Right there at the homepage, there'll be a tab. I think it's Insights, then Free Studies. You'll be able to download it right there. And then that's our podcast research specific page as well. But this was fun. I enjoyed doing this study with you guys, and Trailer Park soon. I guess, Ariel, in the next few weeks, we're going to be talking more about this study on your podcast, right?
Yeah, the idea is I'm interviewing each of you individually. Jay will talk about research studies and what goes into them and why we wanted to set this up, which we touched on a bit, but more importantly, what's the larger picture here and how do we think that this will change or inform podcast trailers going forward? And then I'm going to be speaking also to Peter and to Rachel about the trailers that they were making up to this point, what the changes they're going to make are, and then we're also going to get into the trailers. We're going to analyze them in full. So we'll play the full 60-second trailer, and then we'll talk about the choices that they made.
Thanks, Jay, for putting this together. And again, go out and make a trailer. If you don't have one, update your trailer. It's great for all kinds of purposes. Hopefully we inspired you to do that.
Yep. Thanks for joining us today.